from the review, what questions do we have? What if you want to go over and want to review before you guys take your test? Number one on the this page or the 21. On this page. It's the very bottom one or that the other one. The very bottom one. You may have done this one already, but you can do it. Right, for this number 21, the number of calories burned while jogging varies directly with the number of minutes spent jogging. If George burns 150 calories by jogging for 20 minutes, how many calories does he burn by jogging for 30 minutes? What's important there? What do we call important, Jackie? Calories varies directly, number of minutes, 50 calories, 20 minutes, calories, and 30 minutes, all the important. So then when you get word problems like this that say the words varies directly, varies inversely, any form of those words, whatever comes first is your y. So number of calories would be y, number of minutes would be x. So every time you see number of calories, that would be y. Number of minutes would be x. So which variable are we solving for? At the end? One. So then because we're in varies directly mode, we have to solve for k by doing y divided by x. So this would be k equals 150 divided by 20. Take the first two numbers that you're given. Divide those, tell me what you get. What is 150 divided by 20? 7.5. And that would be calories per minute. Then after we find our k, we are going to use the last part. So we're looking for y. Our equation is y equals kx. So we're looking for y. We now know our k value. And then we know our x. So multiply 7.5 and 30 and tell me what you get. 25, and we would put labels, so calories. Other questions? All right. 22 on the back. Okay, so 24 on the back, the time required to complete a job varies inversely as the number of people working. It took 4 hours for 7 electricians to wire a building. How long would it have taken 3 electricians to have done the job? What's important there? 4 hours. What else? An electrician. What else? 3 electricians. What else?
Varies inversely.
Varies inversely. What are we looking for? And if you want to highlight the time and the number of people at the beginning, you can also do that. So then, same setup. Whatever comes before the words varies inversely is your y. Whatever comes after is x. So then every time we see something about time or in hours, that's your y. And then anytime we see number of people, that is x. So which variable are we looking for? For how long? Y. So then we are using inverse. So k equals y times x. So we're going to multiply the first two numbers given. And then k would be 28. And then we're going to use our inverse variation equation, y equals k over x. To solve for y, we don't know y, so that stays. We know k is 28 and x is 3. Divide that, tell me what you get. (9.3) repeating. So there's only one answer with 9, so that would be B. But if you wanted to find the minutes to match it with the decimal, take this, divide it by 60, and you get that 0.3 repeating. Remember that if it doesn't say the words varies inversely or varies directly or some combination of those, if they go up together or down together, they are direct. If one goes up and the other goes down, or vice versa, that is indirect. What other questions do we have? Okay. 23 on this week. I'll get it set up for you, but this is really like the first one we did, so we won't solve it. For a group of objects made of the same material, the weight of an object varies directly with its volume. If an object has a volume of 20 cubic inches and weighs 28 ounces, what is the constant of variation? What's important here? Actually, we can solve this one this time. What's important here? And what are we looking for? Constant of variation is what? What are we solving for? Okay. So then the weight would be y. The volume would be x. The volume here is x, weight here is y. To define k, for a direct, we would do y divided by x. And that would be 28 over 20. And then you would simplify that to figure out which value is k. Which would be what? Other questions? Ashley? Say that number one more time. 19 on the previous page. Which set of ordered pairs satisfies an inverse variation? So in order to check this, we know to find k for an inverse, that's y times x. So if we start multiplying these and they're the same, that would be our inverse. Which one do we think is going to be the same? C. So if we were to multiply these two, 2 times 6 gives us 12, and -3 times -4 gives us all the above. So that would be our inverse variation. Other questions? 17 on the table. In the table, y varies directly with x, which equation best describes the data? So first we have to find our k values. Also, we can eliminate a and b because this is how we find k for inverse. And B, C, or D. And we're doing y divided by x, so 6 divided by 10, or 9 divided by 15. These should all be the same, so whatever you get here should simplify to be the same thing, which is what? 6. Simplify them. So 6 over 10, 9 over 15, 12 over 20, or 15 over 25. Simplify that. 3 over 5. There's only one answer that has that, so D. So that would be in our y equals kx format. Other questions? Have they ever come to read the other 21 that we did? I'll search that. So in this one, it doesn't say inverse or direct, so you have to choose or guess. Which one do we think this is gonna be, direct or inverse? Take a guess. No. Inverse, okay. So if it is inverse, when we multiply these, they all have to be the same. So what is 20 times 1.5?
30.
30. 12 times 2.5?
30.
Also 30. 4 times 7.5?
30.
Also 30, and then we know the last one is 30. Because it's the same, that is inverse. If they were not the same, then you would have to try direct by dividing y by x, see if they're the same. If they're not the same, then it would be neither. Other questions? And we have to go back on this one. And we have to go back. Is this one direct, inverse, or neither, just by looking at the format? Neither. Why? The y-intercept is not 0. But it is neither. So it is a line, but it doesn't go through the origin. Jump back to the page that had 1.1. So for this one, if y is inversely proportional to x and y equals 7 when x equals 9, find x and y equals 14. So this is just like the word problems, just not in word problem format. So find your k first by multiplying y and x since it's inverse. So the two numbers we know, 7 and 9. So that k is what value? 3. Then we are asked to find x when y equals 14. The equation to find our inverse variation equation is y equals k over x. We know y is 14, k is 63, but we don't know x. How could we solve for x? Multiplying 63 wouldn't get x out of the denominator. What else could you do? Multiply by x on both sides. These x's cancel, and this is on the other side. So 14x equals 63. Divide both sides by 14. What is x? 4.5. Other questions? Or answers? Number 4, you have to see, is this one of your formats, your direct or inverse equation, or is it one of the ways to find k? Is it any of those? Is it one of the direct or inverse variation equations, or is it how you find k for inverse or direct? Okay, it's not one of the, it's not direct or inverse, in the format of the equation. Is this how we find k for one of them? Yes, which one? Inverse. So if you know that by looking at it, you don't have to do any work. But if you don't remember that, you can solve for y, divide both sides by x. This is the inverse variation equation format, and that would be inverse. 6 is not in any of those, so you'd have to solve for y by multiplying both sides by 2. And this would be direct, inverse, or neither. Inverse looks like this. So it's direct. Right. 3. So again, this is not in any of the 4 formats. So if we were to solve for it, divide both sides by 4. Which one do we think this is by looking at this? Direct, inverse, neither. It's direct. Because you have to know that this is the same thing as y equals 1/4 x. Those are the same. So it is direct. Last question. If any. Okay. Number 5. So if you see something that looks like this, you know it's going to be linear. So either direct or neither. If you see a number that is not 0, it's most likely going to be neither. You could solve it just to make sure. Subtract x on both sides. Divide everything by -3. This would be y equals positive 1/3 x minus 5. Would that be direct, inverse, or neither? Neither, because it is a line, but it doesn't go to the origin. So if you see something that looks like this, you don't have to do the work. You can just say that's going to be neither. But if this 15 were a 0, that would be direct. So keep that in mind. This. So that one was the last one, we're not gonna do another one where I have to solve it. But this one, you could divide these and figure out if they're the same one. Go ahead and clear off your desk, except for your calculator and something to write with.